Every so often I'll talk about the slow and painful death of Mozilla, even going so far as dedicating an entire video just to this one topic. And every so often I'll get people saying things like, oh, don't be so mean to Mozilla. Mozilla is such an important web company. Or Firefox isn't dying. It's really popular on Linux. And sure, Mozilla is incredibly important. Mozilla has been one of the pillars to the internet since the days of like Netscape Navigator. And sure, Firefox is very popular on Linux, but the Linux user base is very tiny, and then the user base of Firefox on Linux makes that an even smaller group. And over the past 2 years, nothing has really changed. Firefox is slowly dying as it's always been, and it's lost about 50 million monthly active users since January 2019. So back at that point, it had about 244 million monthly users. In July of this year, it had about 197 million, which is approximately a 20% drop in users. Now, this might not seem that important if you don't know the way that Mozilla makes most of their money. So, Mozilla at this point is effectively a Google sub-brand. What I mean by this is a lot of the funding that Mozilla has comes from the fact that Google is the default search engine inside of Firefox. And there will come a point where that deal isn't valuable enough for Google to actually make and will simply just cut it off. When that happens, I don't know if Mozilla's going to survive. If you paid any attention to the news for the past 18 or so months, you would know why this 2-year period is very different from any of the ones prior. If you're a web company and you can do all your business online, you've probably just skyrocketed in value. Mozilla, on the other hand, this has happened to their user base, and this, I think, indicates a much, much bigger problem that exists with Mozilla and exists with Firefox. Now, interestingly, most of the regions have dropped in users, with the exception of one. So, France, Brazil, Germany, India, even India's dropped. That's a really weird one for me. Italy, Poland, Russia, everything has dropped except for China. China actually has grown slightly in users, but it has definitely grown. I don't really know how to explain this value. I would have said it's because there are people in this region who are getting onto the internet for the first time, and that just means there are more people who are gonna potentially try out Firefox. But that would also indicate to me that India should have been growing as well. But it hasn't. So unless someone happens to know what the deal is here, I'm not really sure what's happening. So moving past that, why is Firefox bleeding users? Now, some people are going to say, oh, it's because Mozilla is getting political and because they're funding certain organizations they don't like. But I don't think that really has anything to do with it. Maybe some people stop using Firefox because of that, but most people who use the internet don't really follow tech news and are going to be making their choices on something a little bit different. Okay, then what about the reason on the Reddit thread I found this on where it was saying, is this because when you visit Google and Microsoft properties from Firefox, they promote their browsers via ads? Basically, what he's saying here is if you go to like Google or Gmail or anything that Google owns, you'll get an ad saying, hey, if you want the best experience, go and download Google Chrome. Or if you go to, say, like the Microsoft website, you might get an ad telling you to download Edge. And while that very well might sway some minds, and with what I'm going to say next, might be the thing that tips you over the edge, I don't think that by itself is the reason. I think advertising these browsers sort of has the same effect as advertising something like Facebook or Twitter or Amazon, where most people already know these things exist, so I don't think that just making an ad about it is going to make anyone want to use it. Believe it or not, there was a period where Firefox was a competitively large web browser. There was even a point where it was the largest web browser. When did this happen? This happened when web browsing was absolutely garbage. Back in the days where people were using things like Internet Explorer, and even people who weren't techie knew one thing about Internet Explorer, that it was absolute garbage. And because the default web browser was garbage, people just went and installed something different and usually going to go with what other people say is good. And at the time, that thing was Firefox. Because at the time, Chrome either didn't exist or was still in its very early stages where most people didn't really know about it, and even if it was a really good web browser, there was still so much good press about Firefox that it didn't really matter how good Chrome actually was, because people who didn't care to actually look into it just saw that Firefox was what got all the praise. But since that point, the web has really changed. And it's not like Chrome became the biggest web browser overnight and became the biggest web browser for no reason. If you do a surface level look at Firefox and at Google Chrome, which is what most people are probably going to do if they don't really care about any of the techie stuff, what you'll see is that Google Chrome tends to win out in the categories that most people actually care about when it comes to things like the speed of the browser, when it comes to things like features with progressive web apps, which is basically like saving a website as an application, the Google ecosystem, the browser extension market, which isn't as bad as it used to be, but there are still cases where the extension is only available over on Chromium, when it comes to things like website compatibility. All of these things, it doesn't matter if they are true or not, or if having an ecosystem, all these features, is actually better. What matters is that people say they are better. Just like how I don't really care what tires are put on my car because I'm not a car guy. If the car guy says these are good tires, they're fine to put on the car, but like, yeah, that's cool. People who aren't techies, people who don't care about their web browser, don't really care what web browser they're actually using, as long as it does everything they need it to do, and if it does it better, well, that's good as well. And it certainly doesn't help that Mozilla recently did a massive UI change. It doesn't really matter if the UI is good or not. It's fine if you like it, if you want to use it, that's fine with me. I don't like it, I changed it back. But the reason why this UI change is a big deal is because people don't like change. Change is unfamiliar, and unfamiliar is scary. All of this stuff is what the normies usually care about, but since the CEO changes, it hasn't really been their focus. And because it hasn't been their focus, they've slowly fallen further and further behind to the point where now they have to play catch up with a multi-billion-dollar development company. And when you're trying to do that, unless you're also a multi-billion-dollar development company, it's going to be hard to do. With Firefox users continuing to drop, it's getting to the point where really the only people who are actually using Firefox are people who care about privacy, and that's not a bad thing. If you care about privacy and you want a privacy browser, Firefox is quite good for this. Now, people are going to argue against that, but Mozilla has always taken a privacy stance, having things like account containers, now a built-in tracker blocker, unhindered ad blocking APIs, and if we're going to take their word for it, this is a great stance to hold. But Firefox isn't the only privacy browser, and there's one in particular that has basically been skyrocketing in users. I don't know exactly what effect Brave has had on the Firefox user base, but what I can say is these users didn't just appear out of nowhere. Over the period while Firefox has been bleeding users, Brave has been absolutely skyrocketing. Now, it is a very small company, so it does make sense why it would go up in users, but over basically the same period, starting a little bit later in June of 2019 rather than January, and ending in June of 2021 rather than July, it went from 5 million users to 33 million. Brave is very important here because Brave and Firefox are basically trying to do the same thing. They're both trying to fill this need for a more private web browser. Now, we can argue whether Brave actually is a privacy browser. I'm going to say it's more private than running like Google Chrome directly, but because it does have that ad system, you can make arguments that it's not as private as it really could be. But if you do accept that it's a privacy browser, it's also a privacy browser built on top of Chromium. Therefore, you get all the benefits of Chromium, like progressive web apps, better web support, in a lot of cases, better performance. And it makes it a really hard sell to get people to use Firefox. And I said it before, I want Mozilla to succeed. I don't want a world where Google is the only company controlling everything that happens on the web. But at the rate we're going, that's basically what's going to happen. And that sounds like a terrifying world. But the problem that Mozilla has is a problem they've basically caused themselves. So in the past couple of years, Mozilla has been branching out a lot to basically get more independent funding, so they don't have to just rely on basically Google funding their entire operation. But this is an issue, because they waited so long to start doing this that they didn't actually have enough money to keep all these projects going on at once. When they should have been doing this was back when Firefox actually was a big web browser. I know this isn't really going to be reasonable, but really the only thing that Mozilla can do at this point is somehow catch up to Chrome. Without at least being in line with what Chrome can do, there's no reason why anyone would want to use it, because once you start using Chrome and you start sort of getting all of your workflow bound into these features, it's a very hard proposition to say, okay, here's this thing that might be better, but doesn't have any of those things you need. Why would anyone want to use that? That's the first thing that needs to be done. I know it can't be done, but it's really all it can be. But it would also be very important to keep up that privacy aspect, otherwise you're going to lose most of your existing user base. Basically what I'm saying is make Firefox brave. But I really don't think anything will change with the current executive management, especially when your current CEO basically is taking pay rises as the company is collapsing. So this is when Brendan Eich was fired, took a slight pay dip here. This is when the current CEO took over. Like, what is this? This is insane. I really do hope that Mozilla is still around in 10 years, but at the pace it's going, I really don't think it's going to happen. Obviously, Firefox will still exist. The repo will still be out there. People can go and fork it and make their own browsers, but a web browser is a very, very big task to manage, and I don't think that's something that, at least at the scale we are with modern web browsers, can really be done by a small group of people. Maybe you think I'm wrong and completely disagree with me. If that is the case, let me know in the comment section down below. I am more than willing to have a discussion with someone who can actually back up what they are saying. And if you like this video and you want to support the channel and become one of these amazing people over here, I have got a Patreon, subscribe star, leave a pay, all that stuff linked in the description down below. I've got a podcast called Tech Over Tea available basically anywhere. I've got a gaming channel called Brodie Robertson Plays, where I live stream twice a week and upload about 5 or so YouTube shorts. And this channel is available over on Odyssey. That's it for me, and I'm out.